More developments this week about COVID-19, from the FDA approving the use of convalescent plasma as a treatment to the first case of reinfection in the world. So our 9 Health expert, Dr. Payal Kohli, is back with us to put this all into some context. Let's start with convalescent plasma. We hear the term. What is the data? Tell us more about it, and how do you think it's working, at least as far in the tests that we've seen?
So Tom, plasma, if you recall, is that yellowish component that contains antibodies within our blood. And convalescent plasma simply means that you've taken the plasma from a person who's convalesced or recovered from the infection, and you're then injecting this into somebody else as a potential treatment, so giving the antibodies from one person to the other. With respect to safety data, we actually have great data coming out of the Mayo Clinic with greater than 70,000 patients telling us that this is a relatively safe treatment, and aside from the risks of a usual blood transfusion, which are relatively minor, there's not a lot of safety signals. But the efficacy data is where things are a little bit weaker. So, we saw some patients in the clinical trials get better with convalescent plasma. We've all heard the stories, but the problem is we don't know what would have happened had they not gotten convalescent plasma, because there wasn't a control arm for the majority of these patients. Now, a small study in the Journal of the American Medical Association looked at about 103 patients where there was a control arm, and that seemed to suggest maybe a trend towards a benefit of convalescent plasma, but it wasn't statistically significant. So we don't know if that's because there really wasn't a benefit or because the numbers are too small to detect a difference. So I'm a little concerned that the efficacy signals are weak. We don't know exactly when to give the plasma. We don't know what dose of plasma to give, and still a lot of outstanding questions remain.
And yet it is now being approved. That emergency use authorization, like anything that has to do with COVID-19, is viewed from all sorts of lenses, from scientific and medical to political and emotional. What is your reaction to that EUA, as they're calling it, from the FDA?
So I'm surprised, based on the data, that it underwent the EUA. I'm also a little concerned that it's too premature, because now that it has undergone the EUA, as a physician and most other physicians will be much more likely to reach for it for their patients without, again, having great data that it works. And then secondly, when physicians start to give it outside of the context of a clinical trial, it actually disincentivizes patients to enroll in clinical trials, because they can just get it outside of the trial. And the problem with that approach is that all those unanswered questions still remain. We won't get them answered because we won't be able to enroll people into the trials.
Well, maybe we will learn more as we go, but we'll see how that plays out. A lot of people say if you get it, you can move on from it as far as COVID-19, and herd immunity comes into play there as well. But now a man in Hong Kong confirmed to have COVID-19 for a second time. What does this mean as far as what we know about reinfection?
So what was interesting about this case, Tom, was that genetic analysis on the strain showed us that he got infected with a mutated version of coronavirus. So it was different from his original strain. What was also interesting was that in his initial infection, he was symptomatic. He had flu-like symptoms. However, upon reinfection, his body appeared to react in a different way. He was asymptomatic, and it was picked up on screening. So obviously something that's much harder to detect. And reinfection is not a concept that's new to medicine. We see it with the flu all the time, every year, and it can happen for two main reasons. The first is the virus can mutate, as it did in this case, and the second is that our antibodies and protective responses can wane over time, with some studies saying that they can start to wane as early as 20 to 30 days. In this case, we saw reinfection at 4 months. So this is really, in my opinion, the first of probably more reinfections that we're going to see. Thankfully, it's not that common thus far, but again, time will tell as things go on whether those antibodies wane more.
Well, we certainly learn more about it all the time, and we appreciate you helping us learn more along the way. Our 9 Health expert, Dr. Payal Kohli.